Welcome to the fourth podcast of the series on development banks in the green transition. This episode 4 is on blended finance and other collaborations between development banks and what they have to do in order to unlock funding for climate action. I am the moderator of this conversation, among friends here, but particularly between two great friends and people that I admire, Winston, Fritsch, and Amar, Bhattacharya. I'm going to introduce them to you very quickly. The name of the episode is Blended Finance and Other Collaborations. And this podcast is a product of the project Enhancing Resource Mobilization for Sustainable Investment through multilateral banks partnering with the national development banks. And it's a partnership between Brazilian Center for International Relations, CEBRI, and the Center for Global Development. It has 6 episodes. The project basically is trying to look at at the moment that we have in a conversation about reforming the international, and particularly the multilateral development system, is trying to have a look from the South of how this reform could benefit in increasing the partnership with national development banks in order to mobilize more resources, particularly for developing countries in doing a transition for a more just and sustainable world. As I said, I'm Rogério Studart. I'm a senior fellow at the Political Economy Center at CEBRI. I'm a macroeconomist specializing in international finance, and I have a passion for the issues of climate change, dealing with the environmental crisis, and of course, using that as an axis or a leverage for development. Winston Fritsch is a great friend, but also was my professor. I have to say, I'm very proud to say that. He's a trustee emeritus of the CEBRI. He is a CEO of Struttura, Project Development and Finance, and WF Consulting Associates. He was the CEO of Petra Energy, Managing Director of Lehman Brothers in Brazil, CEO, Director of the Dresdner Bank in Brazil, partner of Rio Bravo Investments, senior partner at Oriente Investments, associated with Nomura Securities. He was the chairman of the board of Brazilian Association of International Banks and member of the board of Brazilian National Bank Association. And he was also the Secretary International of Economic Policy at the Ministry of Finance. And of course, he's as I mentioned, he was my professor. He was a professor at both Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and PUC in Brazil. Just to make it short, because it's a long CV, let me just move on to Amar here, who has also a very large CV, and he's a good friend, but he's also senior fellow of the Center at the Center for Sustainable Development, which housed in the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. His focus are on global economy, development finance, global governance, risks between climate finance and development. From 2007 to 2014, he was the director of the G24, which is a grouping that basically advocates and debates the issues of IMF and the World Bank for developing countries that are represented there. He has been a very active, I think we all know Amar, he's been very active in discussion of development and climate. He has produced excellent work with Nicholas Stearns and others on looking at climate finance funds. So I think that this introduction does not do enough to say what I think and what people think about these two friends here. But I want to go straight ahead and start this conversation before we spend too much time talking about the lengthy contributions that the two of them have. So, let me start with you, I think that we all have something in common, and I want you to, before the first question, I want to ask you in a personal note to answer a question that I always have, which is, we are all economists. Winston has a long trajectory as a macroeconomist. He participated. He was one of the designers of this real stabilization program. Amar has an extraordinary career in development in the World Bank and the G24. But more recently, you have been focused on the issue of the climate and environmental crisis, and how to fund and overcome this crisis. Why is that? Why did you come to this point? And the second related thing, when you look at the gap that we have nowadays in terms of funding this transition, how do you see that? Can I ask Amar to start that?
Thank you, Rogério. It's a real privilege and pleasure to participate in this podcast and to meet and also join Winston Fritsch in this conversation. So I think, for a long time, and especially from the perspective of the developing countries, we saw the climate crisis as a cost that was being imposed on us in terms of development opportunities, and one which we fairly argued should be, in some sense, compensated for, or at least helped to be paid for by the rich countries. And that view about climate as really now a kind of a constraint or a cost to growth and development really lasted for quite a long time. And, about 5, 6 years earlier, we began to recognize that actually, because of changes in technology, it was possible to act on climate in a way that would not necessarily impose a huge cost, but indeed could be an opportunity to build better and new forms of growth, benefit from the externalities that came from such action, like clean air, more productive cities, more productive ecosystems, and the like, but a recognition that indeed this would require significant uptick in investment. That it was okay to say yes, climate acting on climate is a positive sum game, but in order to respond to it, we needed to be able to undertake the investments that are necessary, both to kind of mitigate against climate change, but also to adapt to climate change and to build resilience. And the second thing that became very clear in that is, for developing countries and emerging markets, a big impediment was the availability and cost of finance. If the finance was not there, of course, you can't do the investment. And if the finance is too expensive, then, particularly for investments that are relatively upfront and capital intensive, the costs of those investments become too high. And that has been the case, not just for the Africas, but even for countries like Brazil, that the cost of capital has been a big constraint. So when we look at the numbers today, we argue that we need something like a fourfold increase in climate related investments between now and 2030. The bulk of that is for the energy transition. But the energy transition, as I emphasized, is also a great opportunity. I'll come back to that more. And we need about, $1 trillion in three buckets: adaptation and resilience, coping with loss and damage, and natural capital and nature-based solutions. So these are, relatively large numbers, but you could think about the productive side of it, the infrastructure related, in the order of 3 to 4% of GDP. So quite manageable. However, the resilience and coping with climate change and the natural capital is a bit more challenging because these are areas where there isn't a really well-defined revenue stream. So ensuring the sustainability of those investments and the financing of those investments becomes a bit more challenging. But we are at a point where developing countries could actually, if they moved strongly, they could in some sense move from behind the class to ahead of the class. And that's something I will come back to in this conversation.
Thank you, Amar. What say you, Winston?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Rogério. Thanks for inviting me and to be with Amar and you in this conversation. You actually posed two questions, one of a more intimate nature and the second more technical. The intimate one was, how did we get into this theme? And for me, it's not a very long, it was not very long ago. I think I started interested in this theme about just before COVID. And obviously, as soon as I understood the existential problem that we face, and I have 5 kids, grandsons, so it's something that immediately I saw it was fundamentally an economic problem. The transition to a low carbon economy is fundamentally an investment problem. You have to change the nature of the production function of the globe, and that you can only do by investment. So this kind of Augustinian revelation changed my mind, and especially when COVID came, I had more time to dedicate to that, and I saw the wealth of literature that was already produced by many people with different approaches, etc. So my learning curve was quite steep, and that was how I came in, and now I dedicate 100% of my time to that in several areas, from education to business, etc. Because, as Amar said, this is a great business opportunity. And why is it? I'll basically repeat what Amar said, but I'll give it a kind of envelope. The fundamental question is that you have to invest to reduce the carbon intensity of the globe. But as all projections show, and Bhattacharya has done a lot of empirical work on that, is investment in the South. To attain the objectives of the Paris Agreement, you have to invest in the developing economies, because otherwise you reproduce China. China was a disaster from a climate perspective, and was a fantastic success, a miracle from the economic perspective. They changed it from $1,000 per capita to $12,000, $13,000 per capita in 2 or 3 in one generation, 2 or 3 decades. But at the same time, they introduced almost a third of the CO2 that we have in the world today. They became by far the large emitter, and that was because they did that with early industrial revolution technology based on carbon, on coal, and that was a disaster. If we repeat that, we're done. So this is not only a problem, it's an urgent problem, because these countries cannot stop. India, for instance, growing by leaps and bounds, will reproduce maybe what happened in China. They are using the demographic bonus to grow at 6, 7, 8%, and will do. The differences are great. In terms of the political system, etc., it's a much more complicated equation. But if India follows China, forget about the Paris Agreement goals. So you have to invest in the developing countries. And although there are many country differences, and we can say that all of them face a problem of high risk, of high country risk. And that's a well-known problem. The market didn't solve that over time, but now we have to do that. Why? Because the market has to solve that. Because if you add the domestic savings of the developing countries to what the multilateral banks can, in the best case scenario of some increase in capital, etc., provides, there's still a huge margin that can only come from foreign private investment. So you have to do something to attract foreign private investment to countries that they would not touch, or would charge, obviously, a very, very high cost of capital to do, which to make the transition impossible. So the fundamental problem, as Amar said, and it's urgent and it's extremely difficult, is to lower the cost of capital in developing countries. Some of this is homework. They have to do good macro policies to attain investment grade as soon as possible, but that's more easily said than done. And then obviously you need a lot of blended finance. You need to do some tricks to reduce the cost of capital to those countries that, although they are moving or implementing good policies, they're still far from being attractive to foreign private investment, which is the fundamental piece in the equation. I think that domestic resources will be mobilized because this is a priority everywhere, although it's complicated. Politically, we have this mismatch between the horizons of the politicians and the best horizon for the decision, the economic decision to do the transition. This is complicated, but the big problem in the developing countries will be attracting foreign private investment to this huge flow that's needed to avoid disaster.
Winston, let me get from there and what Amar have said and ask you this. As an economist, that's one thing that puzzles me, and perhaps you could talk a little bit about this, starting with you, Winston, and then going to Amar, just to revert the order from before. Because the climate risk, with in the increase and then an increased intensity of climate events, we all know that the climate risk is rising very quickly. So, from an economic theory perspective, you would expect that investors, international investors, banks, and all those who have to manage funds, have to allocate resources, would be doing some portfolio diversification. And that would lead to much higher loanable funds to investments that reduce carbon and other emissions. But it's not happening. What do you think is the problem there? What is the failure there, and how can you overcome this market failure?
Right, there are two investments that have to be made in transition. One is short term, and the ones that use technologies that already exist. The other is R&D and early stage technologies that will be needed, because almost half of the technologies that will be in use in the global economy in 2050 are not yet there. So this last one is fundamentally very high risk money, and usually fundamentally government money for R&D, and some high risk venture capitalists, etc. So this is important, but this is not what we're talking here. We're talking about the immediate investment in existing technologies, especially in the electricity transformation. The electrification, which is the low-hanging fruit to start doing business. And you have the technologies there. So it's mainly a problem of capital. Why is it not working? Well, because the risk is perceived as great. And there are two dimensions. One is exchange rate volatility, which you can, in a way, mitigate. But it's all the country risk of these countries that need more money. And this is not an easy solution. You don't have long-term hedging markets to avoid, to attack the problem of exchange rate volatility. And not all countries have investment grades. So you need some form of subsidized capital, if you like, some form of blended finance to do the trick. And that's what's being done. But the short term is quite complicated because, as I said, if something changes radically, like, for instance, it happened in Europe recently, the price of, there's a lack of availability of energy. Prices go berserk, and all the carbon pricing that the Europeans use to allocate capital didn't work. So, and some countries even started going backwards. The former UK government actually stepped back in climate change, etc. So it's going to be a process full of short-term interference from the real economy, but the crucial structural problem is to reduce the long-term cost of private capital to developing countries. And that this is you don't have a recipe for that.
Thank you, Winston. Amar, what say you? What do you think can be done in order to transform this increase of climate risk into action from the private financial sector? And what do you think developing countries particularly could do in order to accelerate the trends that you have observed in other parts? You don't have your microphone.
Sorry. As Winston pointed out,
sorry, Amar.
There are really two sides of this coin. One is, is the financial sector able to provide the finance for the transformation, meaning the mitigation side? And here, I just want to emphasize a point that he mentioned, which is there is real value right now in terms of the renewable energy proposition in emerging markets and developing countries. Because, as he said, this is now about deploying proven technologies whose costs have come down. When we started on the journey on renewable energy, it used to cost $1,000 a watt in the 70s. Today, it is 10 cents a watt. And the price has fallen, literally 50% in the past 18 months, essentially because of the role of China. Not only is this a price phenomena, but the capacity that China has built is a huge opportunity to actually deploy these technologies and to build a new economy on this base, which is really built on low-cost energy. So the development and climate opportunity for developing countries is tremendous. Just take the case of Africa. More than 50% of the solar opportunity of the world is in Africa, yet only 1% of the investment is going to Africa. If we could turn that around, then we would, in some sense, not just solve the climate crisis, but we would, in some sense, give a huge boost to the development possibilities in Africa. But again, as Winston pointed out, there are two sides that have to come together. One is the institutional frameworks around the ability to scale up the investments, most of which would be in the private sector, although there would be need for complementary public investments. And the second, of course, is to ensure that the cost availability and cost of capital and the financial system is not there. Not only that, but the financial system actually, if countries move away from a fossil fuel economy, the financial system is penalizing that move. Look at the case of Colombia. It announced that it was going to limit, its fossil fuel extraction, and its credit rating was, downgraded as a result. So the financial system's first role is to ensure that it is, providing that capital and ensuring that, there is an incentive to invest in the green rather than in the brown. And it's not happening. The second, as you correctly said, is there are, higher and higher risks. And in some sense, if those risks are there, are the financial system taking into account those risks? And as you know, we think about those risks as physical risks, transition risks, and financial risks. And at the moment, the financial sector, of course, as far as emerging markets and developing countries are concerned, is not even close to being in this space. Because remember that, 90 developing countries are not even rated. So the role of the financial system is only in a very negative way, which is, this is all too risky, I'm going to stay out of it. And on top of that, many of the regulatory kind of policies we have, Basel, INSOL, the insurance regulations and the like, make it quite difficult for financial institutions of different kinds, banks, pension funds, insurance companies, to invest in developing countries. All of which says that, the role of development finance institutions becomes really crucial in the space. Why? Because they can, of course, provide that positive financing that I mentioned, but they can also help crowd in some players. They can improve the information, they can incentivize the shifts that we are talking about, and critically, as was mentioned by Winston, help reduce the cost of capital.
Amar, this is, I think, Winston, go ahead if you want to comment
It's
what
an
Amar
example
was going to say.
what Brazil is doing. It may be interesting, Amar, to show how can you do that. But Brazil is a very peculiar case. I mean, it's not generalizable, but because Brazil has immense opportunities to, everybody has, but Brazil can produce cheap electrons at a much greater volume than the domestic demand. So you can use green hydrogen to do other processes, etc. So Brazil can gain a lot. So you cannot generalize, but Brazil introduced, with the support of the Inter-American Development Bank, a program that can be adopted by other countries as well. It's called Eco-Invest. And in one of the lines, if you bring 3/4 of the capital from outside the country, I mean, you bring a blended, mainly private money to do these projects, the government auction, between the several banks demanding this line, auction a line is extremely cheap, giving backed by the AAA rating of the IDB. So this is very important because it attracts for investment and reduces risk. We're talking about the finance component, 70% of the capex. So it's huge. And the other is a facility that takes off the tail risk of FX fluctuations. It's a facility that if it goes beyond a range, if the exchange rate fluctuation goes beyond the range, you immediately restructure this excess in the long term, etc. So it reduces the tail risk of big fluctuations like we had in the Lehman Brothers crisis, etc. So these two elements are to be tested in Brazil over the next few months. It's still being implemented, lots of legislation, etc. It's almost there. So we'll have a kind of laboratory in Brazil to see if with those incentives we move foreign capital to Brazil. But this is not generalized to other things. Brazil is almost investment grade. I think it's moving towards investment grade again. But countries that are, as you said, not even rated or have a very bad rating, there's no miracle. So it's a sad story, but the fundamental transition policy for governments in the periphery is macroeconomic policy. To get a better rating is very important, but this is not enough. Okay, but it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. It's needed even for countries with low risk, high grades. The money will not come easily. Because it has been like that since a long time. Now we need more money, but the conditions are still more or less the same in terms of perceived risk.
So let me ask you this, and perhaps Amar wants to respond on that. Amar just mentioned a case, the Colombian case, that it is, again, raises some questions. Colombia, was trying to phase out from coal, and the rating agencies look at that as, well, if you're going to stop mining coal, you're going to have a balance of payments problems in the future, and therefore your rating is going to deteriorate. It is a market problem. It's a market failure problem. Amar, how you think you can? Yes, of course, you have to have sound macroeconomic policies, but is that enough? What is needed, Amar? What do you think can be done internationally and nationally in order to revert this or to change this market failure?
I mean, there is a lot of focus on it, in particular on the methodologies used by credit rating agencies and how they may need to be adjusted. It's a little bit like the pro-cyclicality debate around capital flows some years ago. But ultimately there's this tension because credit rating agencies says that we are accountable fiduciary responsibility, but we could say your fiduciary responsibility needs to be time consistent, which it isn't. So there is those discussions I think are very much underway. I just wanted to come back again to this idea about how can we overcome some of the constraints, and I do think the kind of partnership that is being talked about in Brazil for the ecological transformation program between GFANZ and Benedez could really help create some of the information bases and create a virtuous cycle of investment. But I always keep a very, very sharp eye on the cost of capital in that. I think in Brazil's history, a big problem always has been that has been this cost of capital issue. So as you pointed out, but I think the experiment underway right now, I think could be a way to close, in some sense, the gap between actual and perceived risks. I mean, that is a fundamental problem for emerging markets and developing countries, which is if you look at the risk premia, they imply, risks that are prohibitive almost. So if you look at South Africa and you look at the expectations around exchange rate depreciation, then, in some sense, it's an unhedgeable risk, and you cannot get any kind of term money with that. And so, and as, Avinash has argued, actual risks are less than perceived risks. And what I have argued is actually, if you have these high risk premia, and Stiglitz and I made this point, many moons ago, is they create self-fulfilling crises, and you get a problem so that in some sense, yes, the exchange rate depreciates because of the, of the lack of confidence and, pro-cyclical or, high volatility of capital flows. And you have so in that kind of a way, the approach, again, that has been proposed by IDV and the Treasury to take out the tailed risks, as Winston was saying, is worthwhile. But it in Brazil, it may work. Honestly, I don't think it will work in Africa. Okay. So I really think that if you face a situation like that, you have to say, look, if the private capital will not come at a reasonable cost, then maybe we should say, let's create the conditions by demonstrating the success And maybe, the development finance institutions should just be in there and in there at scale to prove the point until private finance says, yeah, actually the evidence is there and we are willing to come in, both from the perspective of macro risks and, the project risk that is out there. But I do think that we should not kind of wait for private finance at all costs. If we can get private finance to come in at reasonable terms, great, and that should be the goal. But if it doesn't come in, we should be prepared to ramp up massively development finance and combine local, regional, and multilateral development finance in a way that we have never done in the past. We have never combined these forces of development finance. And, particularly, Brazil doesn't have to worry about things of proven technologies. But if the cost of capital is too high for, say, some of the long-term investments that have to be made, my personal view is you should just go for the development finance.
Mm-hmm. I think
this is very interesting. So go ahead, Winston.
I concur with that. I'm a bit skeptical that market forces or just exhortation of G funds members will do the trick. I think we have to create an environment, a psychological environment among leaders, especially in the North, more or less like we had after the war in terms of European and Japanese reconstruction. But this is an urgent problem. Otherwise, the world will collapse in a way. And but it's a different historical moment, but the animal spirits of the politicians should be looking at this urgent problem in that way. It's not a market, it's not something that the market will deliver. It's a kind of a big Marshall Plan for climate is urgently needed, especially for Africa, and especially for countries that do not have the least chance of attracting foreign practice. And there are big countries like that. South Africa was mentioned, Argentina, etc. These are countries that will not get foreign money for a while, foreign private money. So we need actually much more multilateral government intervention to twist the flows to where they're needed.
Winston, you're right. And there's one thing that people sometimes miss. In the past, whenever you had a big push, to use an expression that became more known in Latin America, a big push from the government side in the right direction. At the end of the day, you create the business and you create the mentality that brings in the private sector. This happened in the reconstruction of Japan, but also in the reconstruction of Germany. Germany, KfW had a very Marshall Plan, of course, but KfW had a significant role in creating horizons and say, okay, I'm going to go into this market, but once the market becomes established, the private sector gets interested in that. I think what you're pointing to is that you need institutions and government policies that break a vicious cycle and turns that into a virtual cycle. Is that what you two trying to say?
I think that one thing the market will deliver is competition between China, US, and Europe in terms of technology. So that may reduce the cost of capital because these countries may produce long-term finance to sell their goods as Exim Bank policies. Okay, this is the only thing I think the market will deliver because competition is going to be fierce. It's already there, and the IRA created that more in the United States. So I think this is okay, but I think what Amar said in terms of the countries that will certainly need development finance is not seen as something important if you see the discussion about the increase of capital of multilateral banks, etc. So there is a disconnect between, I think people are putting a lot of trust in the fact that the private sector can do the trick alone, which it's a fallacy.
What say you, Amar?
In the last 4 years, we have seen a significant uptick in clean energy investment in the world. And indeed, if you look at, the numbers, there's quite astounding. There's been a huge pickup in the US because of IRA. There's been a huge pickup in Europe. And there's been just an extraordinary pickup in China. China invested last year 200 gigawatts in clean energy, twice that of the United States, twice that of, and just, 10 times, not 10, but 8 times more than the developing world. And during that same period, all of the emerging markets and developing countries, other than China, accounted for only 5% of this increase. So basically, they were missing in action, and the only 2 countries where we saw some progress were Brazil and India. Okay, so everywhere else, we have been falling behind. Yet, we are at a moment now where we could get a huge transformation in the clean energy proposition in emerging markets and developing countries because of this solar revolution that I mentioned. And because these are relatively simple technologies and the deployment is relatively simple. Renewable projects in Africa have a default rate that is less than US corporates and European corporates. It's a very good proposition. So what I'm basically arguing is there's this great opportunity right now for these countries to leapfrog. And as Winston said, this is not just only about, the generation, it's about electrification. It's about transforming demand as well. And in that regard as well, the developing world is actually well positioned to kind of, leapfrog in many ways the developed, because we don't have to go through those big infrastructure changes that are necessary. In my country, India, everybody now wants an electric motorcycle. Everybody wants a electric three-wheeler. We have, our cars are small, very easy to electrify. And in India today, there is more demand for electric buses than there is in the United States. So I see a tremendous possibility for the emerging market and developing countries to really, go from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, not just only to meet climate goals, but really to kind of use this for development transformation. Because a world of low-cost energy transforms infrastructure, and transformed infrastructure transforms development. So, I can see transport systems in Brazil completely different, with the possibilities we have, So I feel that this opportunity is really there for the taking, and we need exactly what Winston was saying, a Marshall Plan, but a Marshall Plan where in some sense development cooperative finance really is at the heart of it, not a lot of tax dollars from the rich countries to the poor countries. The second part, which is because of the high costs of climate right now, we saw, 25% of GDP of Grenada disappear in one night, with Beryl. We have to have mechanisms to invest in resilience, to cope with loss and damage, and also, mechanisms for natural capital, like, dealing with the Amazon. So for those, we need a different kind of finance, and for there we will need much more kind of highly concessional or debt-free finance. I do not see that funding coming from the taxpayers of the rich countries, even though I believe they should be contributing much higher sums. So we've been arguing that we need to think about international, levies or solidarity taxes, as we are calling it, to create predictable, adequate funding for the kinds of things that will, require financing, will not come from the private sector and will not even come from the public sector. So we have to think about much more innovative sources of finance, whether it's SDRs, whether it is carbon markets, or whether it is, taxes on aviation, fossil fuel production, or shipping. So I think it's worth, therefore, thinking about this finance challenge in these two quite different kinds of buckets.
Thank you, Amar. I think we should continue this conversation, but we cannot do much longer because we have to stick to the time of the podcast. But let me ask Winston for a last reflection on what Amar has said, and ask later on, Amar, if you can give me 1 minute of your thoughts of how development banks could help in this and unlocking this funding. So please go ahead,
I think,
Winston.
The discussion was much centered on, let's say, investments that have high rates of return, private return, but adaptation's a different ballgame. So that's even worse. In that side, I think basically there'll be public money. There are some possibilities of private-public partnerships because the real estate industry loves certain adaptation projects that increase the value of the land that's being threatened. But overall, it's public money, make no mistake. And as to the role of investment of multilateral banks, it's crucial. It's crucial. They will have to do the trick, together with the rich countries' development banks as well. This set of development banks have an enormous responsibility in financing the transition, because the private sector will only move if some mechanism, like the Brazilian design in Eco-Invest, and still to be tested, work in countries which have high risk assessments, the countries that are low risk countries. So it's not a panacea for the problem of developing countries' transition.
Amar, your last 1 minute thoughts on these issues.
So I'm absolutely on the same wavelength as Winston. On the energy transition side, we have to pursue all means to make available and bring down the cost of capital. And development banks have a central role to play in that regard, including being, in some sense, lenders of last resort. So if the de-risking doesn't produce the kind of results we want, then we should step in. Second, as Winston said, for adaptation, is a very different ball game. Yes, there are going to be possibilities for internalizing some of the gains, for getting private finance in, but a lot of the investments that will be required are really long-term and, will have quite uncertain payback in terms of amounts and periods. I think in the discussions on development banks, there's too much talk only about their role in catalyzing private finance, not enough about the role that they should be playing in a massive scaling up of adaptation finance. So I'm very, very much with Winston in that. And the third point, as I mentioned, is even development finance will not be able to meet some of the needs for blended finance that we are talking about, and we have to find, concessional sources of finance other than order to meet those needs.
Well, thank you very much, you two. I think we covered quite a lot in terms of the issues that have to be addressed. I have to do the closing now. As I said, I wish we could have continued this conversation for another 2 hours. We have to create a podcast that would do that at some point, but I have to close now. I just want to thank you very, very much again and do the closing. I mean, this podcast is a product of the project enhancing resource mobilization for sustainable investment through multilateral development banks, partnering with national development banks. It's a partnership between the Brazilian Center for International Relations and the Center for Global Development. In 6 episodes, we're going to deal with development finance issues and the role of multilateral and national development banks. Once again, thank you, and thank you all for listening.